Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you'll find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic discussed right here on the podcast. Earlier this month, Cornerstone Christian's request to have its athletic department released from its Texas Association of Private and Parochial Schools membership was accepted. And at the same time, the school has been under fire from area athletic directors and coaches after several athletes reportedly transferred to Cornerstone for athletic purposes. To discuss all that, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News writer David Hinojosa, now on the podcast for the first time. So David, great to have you here on the program. Let's first start off with some basics. What is this group, the Texas Association of Private and Parochial Schools?
Well, it's known short TAPPS is what they call it for short. That's how we refer to it. TAPPS is basically a governing body for most of the private schools in Texas. It governs the athletics and most extracurricular activities for most of the private schools in Texas. It's not the only association with private schools, but it's the most prominent one, and it's probably the one that, if I were to guess, maybe 95% of the private schools are affiliated with, and so it's got some stature in the private school community.
And then, so that's kind of one half of the equation that we're talking about today. Tell me a little bit about Cornerstone.
Cornerstone, well, let's see. Cornerstone's been around for about 25 years. It's an offshoot of the Cornerstone Church that televangelist John Hagee founded back in the early 90s, I believe. Recently, the Cornerstone Christian Schools, which is a kindergarten through 12th, they went through about over $100 million in upgrades, and part of that included, or a lot of that included, the athletics facilities. They've pretty much upgraded their, football stadium, gym, that kind of thing. So they've kind of tried to make it I think they described it as kind of a state-of-the-art type facility, and not only at the athletic realm, but also in academics. They're couching themselves as being this, destination type school for high schools on the private school side. That's basically what they're doing over there.
So yeah, it sounds like the academics destination and also sports. You recently wrote that athletes from several sports transferred to Cornerstone over the summer from San Antonio school districts, including Northeast ISD, Northside ISD, and Alamo Heights. So is that completely out of the ordinary? Is it just the sheer number of students who transferred? And what are the guidelines for this situation for incoming transfer students who are going to be playing sports?
Well, to kind of set that up a little bit more, probably in addition to the upgrades that they've already had, they've also pretty much cleaned out the coaching staff that was there previously, and they've hired some, I think some would consider kind of big name hires, and among them is Abram Booty, who comes from the Booty football clan. He's the son of John David Booty. He's known as kind of a quarterbacking guru, I guess, around the high school football circles. He's coached 4 of his sons. He's coached in Louisiana, he founded a couple of teams, or not founded, but he built a couple of teams there in Louisiana into what some consider to be kind of national powerhouses, at least for a little while. They've also hired Sophia Young Malcolm, who's a well-known basketball figure here in San Antonio. She played at Baylor. She played for the San Antonio Silver Stars of the WNBA when that team was still here in the city. And they also hired Mike Carter, who's Reagan. He used to coach. He was a former Reagan volleyball coach, built Reagan into a bit of a local volleyball juggernaut. He left after last year and is coaching these athletes. So you mentioned the number of athletes who have gone there, the number of transfer students, first of all. There have been 19 student athletes who have transferred from area schools into Cornerstone, according to what the Cornerstone people have told us. And you mentioned, is that unusual? It is unusual because Cornerstone is not a very big school, and for a small private school to attract that many student athletes is unusual. You don't see that very often. However, the way that they are framing it is like, we have these great facilities, we have these great coaches. Of course, they're coming over here. That's why they're doing it. Now, then we run into some gray areas.
And so let's discuss that gray area. When the students come in, you mentioned 19 as the number, but when any students come in, what are the rules for athletic transfers within the area?
TAPPS has, and so does University Interscholastic League is the governing body for public schools. So, and they but basically use the same system. So when a student transfers from one school to another, they must fill out this form. It's called a previous participation sports form. So this previous participation form, the receiving school, the school in which the student is transferring, they send that form to the school in which the student is transferring from. Essentially, what the coach who is losing that athlete, so to speak, they must answer 5 questions on this form. And they ask questions that have to do with, do you know if this student has received any kind of financial assistance? Has a student, has a school played for this coach before? Meaning the new coach that they're going to, which is a violation at the club level. Things like that. They're basically 5 yes/no questions. And if any of these answers are a yes, it raises a red flag, and the TAPPS will investigate further. It doesn't mean that an athlete will be ineligible. It just means that they want to investigate it further because there could be a violation.
And then do you have any indication that these new transfers to Cornerstone are receiving any type of aid that you just discussed? And would that be aid for a scholarship for being a good athlete, or an aid for, perhaps good grades, or even something as simple as, typical financial aid because their family might not be able to afford a school like Cornerstone?
Yeah, I know that there are financial assistant programs available, but how it pertains specifically to these athletes, I don't know. I haven't confirmed anything, and as far as I know, we haven't confirmed anything like that. So we'll just leave it at that. So,
David, since you mentioned that if there are, if you will, to label them as red flags and these questions that have to be filled out on that form when a student transfers into a new school in the area playing sports. You mentioned that's not necessarily a deal breaker. That being the case, was there a specific reason to be released from TAPPS, or is this just a precaution on Cornerstone's part? What do you think was the thinking there in this decision?
Well, I think the decision basically, here's what I think. I think that based on, and I'm being very careful here because I've heard things and I haven't confirmed a lot of these things, but my guess is that the athletes that were transferring into Cornerstone, I would just guess that they probably weren't getting cleared to play. And because of that, they would lose a year of eligibility and they'd have to wait out a year before they could play. If you're a senior going into this school, then, your senior year is lost and your basically your high school career is over. My feeling is that Cornerstone was maybe jumping the gun or trying to get ahead of the game, and maybe they knew they weren't going to be in TAPPS anyway. They didn't want to adhere to the TAPPS guidelines because it just wasn't going to work for them. It wasn't going to work for this vision that they have. They really want to be, from what I could understand and from what I can just get after just from reading interviews with them in the past, I think they want to turn Cornerstone into kind of a national type program where they have national prominence more than just the area, more than just the region, and more than just the state. And because of those lofty ambitions, you're going to have to aim high a little bit, and you're going to have to go after or try to get some kids to go to your school by whatever means they're going to do that. and I guess they just felt that the TAPPS was just being too restrictive with their ability to do that.
Now, does that mean there would be some other organization they could become a part of that would have different regulations, or are they just kind of like wild, wild west at this point?
Well, St. Anthony, their basketball program a couple of years ago, there was this recruiting controversy with a basketball player named Charles Bassey, came over from Africa. There was some questions as to how he got here. St. Anthony eventually got kicked out of TAPPS because there were determined to be some irregularities there. And they joined something called the TCAL. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's another private school association. You mentioned to be kind of the wild, wild west. I guess a lot of people kind of consider it to be. It's not a very big conference, and I don't know how many schools it has, and I think it's a lot of it's San Antonio based. But I mean, Cornerstone could do that. I just think they have loftier goals in that. They have mentioned really being a kind of a national. They want to have a national presence, and I don't think any organization in Texas, and there's not one nationally, that would help them meet those goals.
Let's get back to community reaction in other schools. I briefly mentioned earlier that area athletic directors and coaches seem to be somewhat upset with what's going on. What are they saying?
Well, I think a lot of them are upset because they're losing their athletes to Cornerstone by means that they think are not right, by means that are not going by the rules that were set in place by TAPPS. That's why they're mad. And whether that's true or not, they believe that it is. And if you're a football team that's losing 2 or 3 of your kids, you're going to be mad about that. A football coach or any coach, really, your livelihood depends on how well your team does. And if a team is taking some of your players, particularly if they're your top players, I don't know how good any of these players are, but if they're some of your players, they're going to jeopardize that. Yeah, I'd be mad. So and I think I think they feel threatened by it. Now, a lot of this uproar happened before Cornerstone basically lost its TAPPS membership. So I just think there's a sense of I think they're a little worried about what could happen. Is this going to lead to something bigger? And I don't know if it is or not. I think if you're talking about Cornerstone, if they have these national ambitions, if they want to be a nationally known team, I don't know how many San Antonio kids are going to take to get that. I don't know if you can put together a team of San Antonio All-Stars that's going to be able to beat teams across the country that are probably putting together national All-Star teams. So I don't know. It's too early to tell. I think we have to really see how this plays out and see if those concerns are warranted. But yeah, I mean, if you're losing your kids to this school if by means that you think are a little bit under the table, then yeah, I'd probably be mad.
Now, of course, one of the great ways of predicting the future, or at least trying to figure out where things are going to go, is by looking at the past. And this is actually not the first time that Cornerstone Christian has left TAPPS. Could you tell me about that history?
Yeah, back in the 90s, they actually lost their TAPPS membership twice. Both for boys basketball. One was had to do with illegal recruiting. The boys basketball program was determined to have illegally recruited several players from Mexico. Among them was Eduardo Nájera, who played at Oklahoma and had a pretty good NBA career. And that was one of them. They got kicked out of the first time for that. And then the second time, they determined that some boys basketball players were getting illegal benefits. I think it had to do for housing, so they were probably from out of town. So they've been kicked out twice, and still they somehow get their TAPPS membership back. So I don't know if this is going to jeopardize it for good or not. I mean, only time's going to tell, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, this is definitely not the first time this has happened.
Let's focus a little bit more on TAPPS before we have final thoughts, and then kind of talk about how Cornerstone Christian is labeling and kind of framing what's happening at the school right now. I guess we haven't really discussed yet, what is the specific benefit of being a member of TAPPS? That if you were kicked out, why would you want to join again, or why would you want to leave? What's that relationship like?
Well, it's a governing body. It gives you something to play for. I mean, it's just like being in a UIL school, if that means anything to you. I mean, it's there's a certain prestige to it. Plus, it ensures that everyone is playing by the same rules, and I think that's very important. I know there's some prep school academies that's basically specialize in coaching, and at least they purport themselves to be. IMG Academy in Florida is one of them, but that's different. They're an independent. They're not affiliated with a conference, and they're basically saying if you come here, we can get you a college scholarship at a big time school. But for TAPPS specifically, the benefit is just that. I mean, you're affiliated with something, and you're able to play for something. You're able to play for something that's tangible. If you're an independent if you're an independent school that has national ambition, you're not playing for anything specific. You're playing for maybe a mythical national title that some website might give you, something like that. I don't know. I don't know what the end game is here, and that's fine. I mean, if that's something that they want to do, that's fine. But I just think that the TAPPS membership or the UIL membership or any affiliation that you have with the league is good, because I just think that's an important thing to have, just to kind of keep everything level.
And then finally, David, before we say goodbye, recently Cornerstone Christian, they sent a letter out to parents. Seems like this is maybe how they're kind of framing what's going on at the school. Tell me about that language. What did they tell parents?
It's essentially what I had mentioned before. They say basically they've denied any type of wrongdoing, any type of anything that hasn't been above board. So they're just saying basically, we don't have the support from our community schools around our community. They have basically they have tried to. They've labeled these things as baseless allegations, and that letter was sent out informing parents that they intended to leave the conference or to leave TAPPS, and that's basically it. And then they boasted about their athletic facilities, the coaches that they hire. They said this is a great thing. We have these great facilities. We have this great school. So don't listen to what they're saying. We're doing our thing here. We're gonna do a lot of good things for your kids. That's how they have framed it.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News staff writer David Hinojosa for joining me on today's episode of In Depth, our weekly interview program brought to you by expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.